Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new collection of trusted resources to help clarify and strengthen your participation in global missions. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to welcome you to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Today, we're going to visit with a deeply experienced missions leader. Doug has responsibilities to help coordinate both local and global initiatives at his church, so he's personally involved with maintaining that healthy balance. We've entitled this episode, Balancing Local and Global Mission Priorities. Our guest today is Doug Christgau, who, together with his wife Christine, has served as a missions pastor in 3 different churches. That spans over 30 years of experience, and during that time, his churches have sent out dozens of long-term missionaries. He has personally led over 100 short-term mission trips. Doug, I can hardly imagine how you even keep track of that. Doug is currently serving as pastor of outreach at Valley Community Baptist Church in Connecticut. He's an instructor for the Perspectives course and speaks at missions conferences. And he and Christine have 2 children and 11 grandchildren. He was with us way back in season 1, episode 21, on how to build up your missions committee. So, Doug, I say welcome back to the program.
Thank you. It's nice to be invited back.
Well, looking forward to this discussion today. And just before we get going, would you take a minute and just describe for us a little bit about your present role at Valley?
Well, I was called here as the pastor of World Outreach. It was the first person they had in a position of that name. But then about 3 years ago, it was changed to pastor of Outreach, which essentially means that I am responsible for local evangelism here, the witnessing, the sharing of faith locally, not just local cross-cultural like urban ministries, but sharing with friends and neighbors, that kind of thing. And then I also do follow-up. We see between 75 and 100 new Christians per year through our church ministry, and I'm responsible to follow them up and provide a nurturing environment as much as people are willing to receive it.
It just strikes me that this transition, your own transition, equips you uniquely for this conversation today about how churches can balance local and global mission priorities. We've seen in many churches a tension between these two, and today we're going to unpack this a little bit with Doug. Let's start with a foundational question, Doug. From a biblical perspective, why do churches need to give attention to both local and global ministry?
Well, if churches take the Bible seriously, I don't see how they can miss the fact that God's heart for the world is expressed in everything from his promises to Abraham in Genesis 12 until the description of the celebration in heaven that will someday occur in Revelation 5, 7, and 9. And so those bookends of the scriptures have a world missions emphasis, and so do most of the books of the Bible, the Old Testament as well as the New. So it's a biblical mandate. You just don't hang it on Matthew 28 or Acts 1. You know, the Great Commission is in the other 3 Gospels. The Great Commission is in the letters. It's in Isaiah. There are 13 Psalms where God's heart for the world is expressed. So in my view, if you want to be biblical, you need to consider a world vision as God has it.
Amen. You mentioned a really important verse, or one that often comes up in missions discussions from Acts chapter 1, where Jesus says that we will be his witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Sometimes people subdivide this into categories or places. I wonder if you just unpack that verse a little bit with us as far as what's a good biblical way to unpack that verse?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to make sure we understand it's not a sequential list. It's not suggesting that as soon as Jerusalem is taken care of, we can move on to Judea. Rather, it's an expression of God's heart for the whole world. And it's interesting to note that while we typically assume Jerusalem must mean our own backyard, so to speak, if you consider that the disciples who received this verse were not from Jerusalem. They were from areas outside. It really doesn't even follow that if you took it in terms of priorities, which is not correct, but if you did, Jerusalem wouldn't necessarily even mean your own backyard. So if you take a careful look at the verse, I think it just becomes pretty clear that this is a general statement of God's heart for the world, just as Matthew 28 is and many other verses in Scripture.
And so it's going to be appropriate for any local church to simultaneously, instead of sequentially pursuing these, what's near, relatively near, and relatively medium and relatively far away, it is a simultaneous effort to reach all these places.
Yeah, absolutely. I think any balanced missions program is going to consider all four of those areas. I'll just tell you, here at Valley, we have what's called our sharing value. That means we share the gospel with those that are near. And then the other is the reaching value, which means we reach across cultural barriers, whether they are geographically close or far, but we're going to reach across barriers as well as share with those of our own culture.
It's very good. Very good. I have heard some people say, particularly here in North America, we have lots of opportunity to do ministry here at home. You don't have to go very far to find someone who has not embraced the good news of the gospel. Shouldn't we just focus our attention here, reaching out to our neighbors in our own community? How do you respond to folks who may hold this perspective?
Well, similar to what I said earlier, it's very important to be concerned for our friends and neighbors, those who don't know the gospel. But we also, I believe, have to be concerned with the people who don't live in an environment where the gospel is readily available. I mean, statistically, about 1/3 of the world, and that's conservative, about 1/3 of the world does not have access to the gospel. So is it right? We have to think of, is it right to just so prioritize reaching our neighbors that we ignore literally 2+ billion people who have no access?
Doug, what are some of the reasons that churches wrestle with balancing local and global? We hear that it should be a both and instead of either or, but nevertheless we struggle with it. Why is that?
I think it's a matter of information. We have abundant information about what's going on locally. We have our own circle of relationships and family members, first of all, and then we have news media that, for the most part, focus on the things that interest people the most, and that's what's going on next door. So with that constant message, it takes an extra effort to say, well, local is important, but I'm going to take the trouble to learn more about the world out there. Mm-hmm.
Boy, out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
Part of our role then, as those that are advocating for global missions, it sounds to me it's an education role. It's an information role. I guess we're just acknowledging too, though, that it's difficult because we live in a noisy season. There's just tons of information bombarding folks.
Yeah, and I think another dimension of it is generally, especially Americans, we want to do something where we feel we're making a difference. And a church can become a sponsor for a school or for some local institution and truly make a difference, provide enough backpacks for every kid in the school or provide lunches for every kid in the school, that kind of thing. But then when you consider the world hunger, or the world's need for clothing, or you name whatever basic items they might need, then it becomes overwhelming. So I think most Americans can relate to, hey, let's put this school, let's fully resource this school, but we can't worry about the country of Pakistan, with millions and millions of people, because it's just too overwhelming. It's a finger in the dike, so to speak, to make any efforts to help them.
Well, that's important for us as well as we try and communicate, I guess. It's true that the numbers are very big. You mentioned a few minutes ago, the numbers of unreached peoples, or in UPG's unreached people groups, could be 1/3 of the world's population. How do we make that accessible to people so that they can say, boy, I'm just one person, or we're one family, or we are one church, but we can participate in God's movement? We're going to need to communicate it in the right ways.
Yes, and I think some careful thinking and praying needs to take place about what piece of that challenge is God calling you to deal with. Back in the day, adopting an unreached people group was a pretty popular idea, and this is 20 to 25 years ago. I can't exactly say why adopting a people group does not seem to be such a vibrant option at this point. Mm-hmm. But I will say that the churches that are moving ahead in missions have identified what they believe their priorities are. And in our case, for instance, we've identified Muslim ministries as our priority. Now, granted, there are over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, and we're not trying to reach all of them. We're focused on the Middle East and North Africa. So by identifying that area and that people group, we've been able to communicate to our congregation some tremendous progress that's being made in those very difficult areas. Mm-hmm. So making choices like that somewhat pares down the challenge, and again, gives you a sense of traction, gives you a sense that, well, we're investing in this particular area, and here's what we have to show for it.
Well, let me ask just about the process that you engaged to identify some of those priorities. What are some of the factors that churches should consider as they try and identify these priorities?
Well, I tackled this shortly after I arrived here. I've been at this church now about 15 years, and I had 2 previous churches. I had sort of learned a few things through earlier experience. So I sought the opinions, frankly, of church leadership. I actually developed a survey that I asked elders, staff, and World Outreach Committee members to complete. That was about 30 people between those 3 groups. And we got back about 20 of them, 18 or 20. And it was off of those answers that we established that we were going to pursue unreached people. And then I did suggest the Muslim area for some specific reasons, and they bought into that. So somehow you need to get close to the leaders of your congregation. I'm not saying a survey is the only way you would do it, but that's the approach that I took. The perspectives on the World Christian Movement class, I can't endorse that highly enough because, again, I think that gives you a great foundation for looking at the world that God made and what strategies there may be for representing Christ in that world. And there are also consultants. There are people you can hire who will take you through a process and help the church to figure this out typically over maybe a weekend, a Friday through a Saturday night, something like that.
Mm-hmm. I know you've been acquainted with Ellen Livengood, who is with Catalyst Ministries in Pennsylvania there. We did an interview with Ellen, and she is one who helps a church walk through a very prayerful, deliberate process to prayerfully identify some of these priorities. Is there an area, a ministry, an unreached people group, a community or region that you would prioritize as a local church and begin to pour into that? I really appreciated, Doug, and I don't want to miss just highlighting a bit, the congruence between the global missions team or the missions committee, whatever it might be called in a church, and the elders or the leaders and the pastors or pastor. I have seen, unfortunately, some tensions arise in churches when a well-meaning committee proceeds with an agenda and develop it, but it hasn't been developed in lockstep, lock arms, whichever, with the leaders. Have you ever seen that?
Yes. I call them missions fanatics. People who get a vision and take off and have a few partners in crime that join them. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is that they're not paying attention to the people who actually influence the church. And in today's day and age, the staff are the primary influencers, and then the elders are typically second, and they're important people. You just can't move in a church or get something done in a church without the support of that group. And I don't think it's a biblical idea either to ignore the pastors and the teachers, the staff people, and the elders, because these are roles of leadership that have been designated by Scripture.
Yeah, that's right. Well, what are some of the principles that churches can keep in mind then as they conduct these evaluations and even refine some of their priorities?
Well, I think it's important to think in terms of what you believe is important, and you can come to those conclusions through some of the resources that we've already mentioned. Mm-hmm. But I think it also has to become somewhat personal as you realize, well, who in our church has the potential to do missions, has interest in doing missions. And as you get to know those people, that also you can either provide them direction in the priorities that you've already established, or if you're really a blank on the priorities, then you might want to confer with those that feel called and assess the quality of that call and where it is, what it is, and perhaps link to that. I do know churches that have primarily built their strategy on who from the congregation is going into missions and how they can help them.
I know that you've talked about early detection at times, and even the list that we looked at prior to recording here, that you talk about keeping a prayer list of those expressing interest in missions, and sometimes that includes young people.
Absolutely. One of Valley's gaps when I came was they had not sent a long-term missionary for quite a while. They had done it, but not for some years. So yes, we began to identify anyone from middle schoolers on up that would express interest. And to encourage the expression of that interest, we would hold events from time to time for people that would respond to the question, is missions in my future? Now, we didn't have huge crowds to those events, but we always had some 10, maybe 15 people who would come to an event like that. Mm-hmm. And then we would work with them to encourage their interest. We also rely on our short-term trips. We have a lot of short-term trips, and interest in long-term missions is always one of the debriefing questions. And it also helps us to identify who might have an interest. And yes, then they get onto a prayer list and some other steps.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like a very intentional process that you have set up. And Doug, what would you say to someone who is trying to identify these candidates? Maybe they're youth and they've been on short-term mission, or someone else in their congregation has interest and it's just them. What advice would you have for someone who just has to do it on their own?
Well, on the short-term trips, most short-terms have some kind of a debrief or a feedback form at the end of the experience. And that's an easy question to add. Do you have an interest in long-term missions? So, one person can go through those debriefs and note those individuals who express an interest. Mm. Or you can recruit people. Again, one person could recruit 2 or 3 more to go with them to our perspectives class. They're all over the place. You don't have to host your own class, but you can probably drive in 30 to 60 minutes and come and find one in the fall or in the spring of a given year. So bringing some folks along with possible missions interest to an experience like Perspectives could be very fruitful.
Excellent suggestion. Well, in just a few moments, we're going to ask Doug to summarize some of the other factors that churches can consider as they balance local and global ministry opportunities. Before we get to that, we'd like to share with you this mission resource that we hope would be helpful to you and your church.
Do you want to learn more about missions? Are you looking to mobilize your church for global missions? Perspectives is a dynamic 15-week course where you'll learn more about God's global purpose and about what He's doing in the world. You can hear about Perspectives right here on the Global Missions Podcast by listening to episode 14 with Wayne Matthews. Visit perspectives.org or perspectivescanada.org to find a course near you. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back with Doug Christgau, and we're talking about the balance between local and global outreach. Our conversation is going to a bunch of different corners, and in fact, during the break, we got onto the topic of short-term missions. We talked about short-term mission. How can it effectively fit into what we're talking about?
Well, I think short-term missions need to be executed or carried out in partnership with people and mission organizations that we have a vested interest in. I think it's best to ask, assuming that you have some partnerships, you support a few missionaries or you support a few agencies, it's important to ask those people or organizations, is there some way in which we could put together a short-term team that would provide some kind of service in the ministry that you're involved with? I'm personally, philosophically, I'm still a fan of the idea that North Americans can go and actually contribute to the ministry of someone, even if they're on a short-term basis. So there's a contribution for the missionary host, And then there's the skin in the game, or the real life experience that the short-term person comes home with, and they sort of gossip the gospel. They'll talk to their friends, they'll talk about the trip, they'll show pictures. In fact, we make a big deal out of public celebrations of these trips in order to draw more people to what took place. So the point is, as opposed to having a one-off short-term mission, you hire some agency that's just short-term missions, and you go and you do something, you come home. Nothing happens the other 51 weeks of the year. Mm-hmm. I just think it's inefficient, and it doesn't deepen the conviction of your people in any particular direction, except maybe they got to hug some little kid at an orphanage, and that meant something. But in the bigger picture, I think you want your short-term ministries to fit.
Doug, what are some of the other factors that sending churches should consider as they're evaluating both local and global ministry opportunities?
I think that, again, you need to figure out how you're going to slice that pie. What specific dimension of unreached are you going to get into? And then also, what are you going to do locally? And you want to keep your partnerships to a reasonable number. I don't think I've said that before, but it's one of my big convictions. If you're a church that's got 40, 50, 60 partnerships, it's unlikely, especially if you're a smaller church, that you can do anything besides just giving $50 a month and maybe mentioning someone in prayer once in a while. That's not going to develop the relationships that you need in order to really care and even keep up with a particular ministry. So we, in our ministry here, the numbers are unimportant, but the percentages are, we've only increased our partnerships by the number of partnerships by 20%, but we've increased our funding by in excess of 300%.
Wow.
And, so that means that we are deeply invested financially in these partnerships, and the number of partnerships is limited enough so that we can have a substantial prayer support for each one of those ministries. So we can identify 50 to 150 people that are praying for each one of these ministries within our congregation.
Wow.
So limiting the number of partnerships takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of saying no to people who call you and contact you, good people. But it keeps your ministry on an even keel. And for smaller churches, I'd say like 10 partnerships, that's plenty. Even though, again, if you have a missions program of any kind, you're going to have people stopping by one every week or two asking for help. You just have to be polite and positive, but you need to say no if you're going to maintain any kind of quality and depth to your missions ministry.
Well, it's a little bit cliche-ish, but you just used the term there. If I'm understanding right, you just mean pursue depth, not breadth.
Absolutely.
And we want to acknowledge that the Spirit is leading as well, but there just seems a real wisdom in establishing priorities that a church of any size, as you've said, the numbers are not so important, but a manageable size for a particular congregation that they can have their hearts and minds around to participate deeply there.
Right. Can I share one more metric?
Sure. Yeah.
You
please.
can cut this out if you.
This is really good.
I look at, as I visit churches, I look at how many of their partnerships are stateside and how many are international. We're not talking about unreached people and all that. We're just talking about who's in the States and who's overseas. Okay. And the typical church will have at least 50% of its people in the States. And again, I would just challenge you, in a world of great complexity and great size, do we really want to keep 50% of our money in the U.S. while so much needs to be done overseas? So it's just a simple metric, but it's one that I keep in mind, and we're quite careful to keep our domestic partnerships. For us, we keep it below 25%, and it's hard. It's hard to do that, but we do because we want to have a balance and we want to reflect what the Great Commission teaches us.
And that's been affirmed by your leadership ahead of time, and it gives you rails to run on. And so your ratios, if I can call them that, are disciplined, intentional ratios. It's not just reactive. You are being proactive. You're being intentional in it. Doug, let's talk about some practical ideas here. If folks are listening and they're saying, yes, we'd like to step toward this, what are some things that they can do to get started in determining these strategic priorities?
Again, I think you've got to start a discussion. You've got to start with your leaders and say, where do we believe God wants us to go? You can't be blind to the fact that if you just let the missions program go in the path of least resistance, it's not going to make an impact. And Americans and Canadians, they want impact. You're not going to get it if you just let the program develop naturally, so to speak.
Yeah, if we're not intentional about it, your experience has been it will migrate toward the immediate context, toward what's near, what's got a louder voice, which means we will spend more on what is local as opposed to a disciplined pursuit of what is also global.
Yes.
Are there best practices that you're going to encourage churches to adopt to uphold this balance in, between local and global ministry?
Again, we have the ideals in place, but we actually do an evaluation of our budget on an annual basis to make sure that our strategic categories, we do it by percentages, like evangelism and church planning amongst unreached groups. That's supposed to be 25% of our budget. So we check and we categorize our ministries and add those up that are in that category, and we see if there's 25% there. And then we go on. We have 6 different categories of ministry, and we just check on an annual basis to make sure that our financial planning is reflecting that. I'll just mention another resource that I have found to be very helpful and stimulating. It's called Mission Frontiers. You can get it as a hard copy magazine, or you can get it online. It's produced by what used to be called the U.S. Center for World Missions. I think it's called Frontier Ventures at this point.
Yep.
But that's just another good resource.
I wonder whether you have a word of advice for a church that has a missions program now, and I'll speak to the global effort, in particular the global side of things, and they are spread rather broadly, rather thinly perhaps. They'd like to take steps toward being more focused. And while it may seem just logical what to do, I wonder what advice you would give to them if they wanted to begin this. Where should they start, and what advice do you have for them?
Well, if you're a sports fan, you know about the limits of salary caps, and what you need is some cap room. You need some financial room to negotiate and to strategize. And the only way you're going to get that if you're stuck, if your missions ministry has been the same for X number of years and the finances are basically the same, then I think you have to make some judgments about what ministry should we stop supporting. And it's distasteful to most, I understand it, but you've got to take a hard look at what your current investments are, what your current commitments are, and you've got to ask yourself, are all these fruitful? Are they producing fruit? Is there authenticity to them? Are they communicating well with us? Is there evidence that they're innovative in their approaches? And the groups that don't fit in that category are the individual missionaries who don't, with severance pay and with love and compassion, you need to let them go. Because that's the only, again, if you're a church that's had the same budget for the last 10 years or something like that, or maybe it's even less than it was 10 years ago, you've got to create a little room to be strategic. And practically speaking, probably the only way to do it is to take some folks off that missionary list, again, gently and with a little bit of money to soften the blow. But you've got to make decisions.
We do want to do this with care. Unfortunately, sometimes churches with good intention pursue this. I have seen it. But their tactic to carry out some of these decisions and informing workers that they've supported for years or decades has been, less than caring, or at least interpreted that way by the worker. And so we do want to do it with care.
Yeah, I think brutal would be the adjective you're looking for.
Yeah, that's it.
I've certainly heard those kinds of stories as well.
Yeah. Well, Doug, in closing, if you were to speak to a church leadership body today, they're wrestling with this balance of local and global priorities. How would you encourage them? What do you say to them?
I'd say keep thinking, keep talking, keep this as an active subject of conversation until you feel like you've made some progress. It's easy enough to say, oh, we've got way too much for foreign, or oh, we've got way too much for local. But you've got to do more than moan about it. You've got to do more than be discouraged. You just need to start the conversation. And again, leadership will keep the conversation going. There's plenty of times when you've talked about things but never actually did them. This is a place where you just need to keep trekking. And I think Ellen's approach, Ellen Livingood, I think she does this over a year's period. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some wisdom in that, because it's not something you can do quickly. Again, if you've got the resources to have somebody like Ellen keep you on task, then that's certainly to the good. But even if you don't, you just need to recognize that leaders persevere. Leaders keep going, and keeping going in this case means drawing this concern to a practical conclusion, not just continuing to wring your hands over the dilemma.
Well, I will just remind our listeners that the resources that have been mentioned, and there have been a number of them through this conversation, we will gather together in the show notes with some links and include those for you there. Doug, if any of our listeners would like to follow up with you for an additional conversation to learn from your wisdom, and how could they reach out to you?
Just send me an email. I'm glad to respond, and it would be my privilege to share some of the information. I have most of it organized into workshops, and would be glad to send it over.
Thank you. We will include Doug's email at the church, Valley Community Baptist Church in Avon, Connecticut. And I just want to affirm what he has said. He has organized so many good ideas. I would encourage you, if you're serving in a church on a committee, or perhaps as a pastor who would like to get some further order to your missions program, Doug would be a great resource for you. And Doug, to you, we say thank you again for spending this time with us. Thanks for sharing some of your experience and your wisdom with us. Just entrust you for the Lord's blessing as you serve at the church, local and global. Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes our conversation with Doug. We are so glad that you joined us today. When we finished recording, Doug wanted me to mention missions is not only for young people. His church has had great success in helping people making a transition to use their life skills and education, all of that, and moving it into a mission-focused ministry. So perhaps that word is relevant to you today, and I wanted to mention it on his behalf. Remember that you can find the show notes for today's episode at globalmissionspodcast.com, and that includes all the links to the resources that were mentioned. That's all for now. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.